In part one of this two-part series, David Simon reflects back. So given all of your prior experience as a lawyer and negotiating, what did the practice component bring to you, David?
It was interesting, Tom. I mean, it was an opportunity to like experiment with some of these techniques that we learned about, that we read about, some of the research, in a really, in a more sort of structured, almost like scientific way. That was really valuable. I learned some things and like some concepts, like you probably are familiar with anchoring, the concept of anchoring, and that's just, I'll just use that as one example. So there's a lot of research that shows, just in terms of how the mind works in a negotiation, if you can anchor the range closer to where your position is than your opponent's position, you're more likely to get a favorable result. And there's all kinds of research on it that shows, different experiments that show that if you start at if you're the buyer and you start low, very low, you're more likely, if you get a deal, you're more likely to get a deal that's closer to the low end than the high end. And so I hadn't really used that consciously anyway in my practice. And so I was able to try that out, in these simulations, and it worked actually. I was kind of surprised. I was surprised. There's a lot of caveats to that, of course, but I was surprised at the impact. And it was interesting too, because then you could compare. I mean, we'd split up as a class and everybody would do these negotiation exercises, and then we'd come back and sort of share our results and share our experiences. And you could see, like the mock negotiation where I tried this anchoring technique, I ended up at a level that was quite a bit better than a lot of my colleagues. So it was a really good exercise. It was really fun to be able to sort of combine, right, that theory with the practice. I really think this is actually an area where we don't do a very good job as law firms training our associates. I think it's one of these things that we kind of take for granted. We spend a lot of time on advocacy and, oral advocacy and writing and, building arguments. I'm not sure we do quite as well with the negotiation piece. I'm actually going to try to take my assessment that I did for this course and turn it into an article for lawyers. And I might actually work on doing some training for our firm on this too. I think there's a lot we can do better than we currently do.
I might even expand that insight to law firms do very poor jobs on training anything that's not fun. So, unfortunately, that's about 90% of the practice of law now. Well, so what are maybe some core lessons that you might be able to put in this article, or if you wanted to take the next step and maybe even do in-house or other training for lawyers around negotiations?
Yeah, so a couple of the sort of the insights that I came away with. The first is to really one of the things we learned. We did some kind of personality test assessment things, and we learned about the different styles of negotiation, and most people have different fundamental styles. There's the sort of aggressive, that sort of traditional lawyer, aggressive, kind of confrontational. There's sort of the avoiding conflict style. There's the compromise style, and then there's sort of a value creation style. And it's interesting. I mean, people tend to cluster, have strengths in certain styles, and that affects how you approach this. But one of the things that I sort of took away from that part of the course was, I think negotiations really usually are, and certainly ought to be more of a team sport, where you work together with a group. And I think it's really important negotiating high stakes disputes and issues to make sure you have the right complement of styles, right? Like it's sort of a much more nuanced version of good cop, bad cop, but it's, you want to put together a team of people with different approaches to negotiations, different strengths in negotiations, to try to, accomplish your overall goal. That was one thing that I thought was pretty important. The other is just the importance of preparation. I think for lawyers, we have a tendency, we're really well prepared on the facts and the law, and in terms of like our ability to, really know what the dispute is, know what the, in a litigation context, let's say, we're deep into that. We tend to be less deep into, what are our clients' interests here? What are their real, not just the position in the negotiation, but what are their interests? What are they trying to accomplish through this? What are their broader, business goals and objectives? How does that all fit together? Who are the different constituencies within, say, a corporate client that might have slightly different, interests in the issue that's being negotiated? So really understanding that, preparing it. And then I talked about the BATNA before.
David, can I interrupt you before you get
Sure.
to BATNA? Because it really struck me in your last remarks about the client's objectives, maybe even multiple objectives from subgroups within clients. And it seemed to me that really lends itself to some of the discussions we previously had into taking a much more holistic approach to the delivery of legal services, where you're really moving to a counselor even position, as opposed to perhaps an advocate. Do you see that sort of insight as something that we might be able to think about it as lawyers as we enter whatever the project or assignment is?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that you put your finger on what I think is sort of a theme for me of this whole program and the analysis. I think that's right. I think one of the big problems that we need to overcome as lawyers is to broaden the way we think about our clients' problems and not get myopically focused in on, the particular dispute, the particular lawsuit. It's always bigger than that. It always reflects a bigger business problem. So I think this is another great example of that theme.
So I interrupted you. You were about to talk to us about BATNAs and objectives.
Yeah. So BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement, I think, whatever. That's the idea. Like, okay, so when you're preparing, you really need to work with your client to understand, okay, what is plan B? Like, if we don't get a deal here, what's our best alternative? Is it go to trial in a dispute? Is it, kill the deal in a transaction, and understand, the benefits and the costs of that alternative. That helps you set your position, your sort of drop dead walk away position. It helps you strategize as you prepare for how to get there. I think that's really an important insight. I talked about anchoring. I thought that was a really interesting dynamic and something kind of an important takeaway. One of the things about anchoring, though, I think it's important. The way our professor described it, which I really liked, was, your opening offer, which anchors the thinking about the negotiation. It should be, low enough or high enough, depending on which side you are, that you kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable even saying it, right? Like take what you think the low end is and maybe push it a little bit farther than that. It obviously has to be defensible, and you have to understand where the other side's position is, what their interests are. Obviously, the risk of anchoring too low or too high is that the other side just walks away and they just don't take you seriously, and it kills the process. So you got to figure out that balance. But I think it's interesting, and there's an important insight there for us as lawyers as we negotiate. We spent a lot of our time, getting past the sort of the binary fixed pie negotiation and working on the skills to create new value through the negotiation, right? So it's not just fighting over a fixed set. It's, can we use the negotiation to create a relationship that creates value for both sides that wasn't there before? And that goes back to your holistic thinking for lawyers point, right? To be thinking beyond just, you've sued me and I think you owe me X dollars and you don't think you owe me X dollars. How do we fight about that? To, we're a supplier, you're a supplier of ours. We have a long-term relationship. How can we use this negotiation to maybe restructure the relationship, to change the terms of how we're dealing with each other? Maybe if we buy more from you, you can invest more and, deal with whatever the issues are that creating the dispute, or, whatever, something like that. I think that's a really important part of this. And then the last sort of big observation I would note is just the importance of, thinking past the resolution of the negotiation, right? Think like a lawyer, think like a litigator, about what could go wrong. And, keep in mind that you can win the negotiation, you can get the deal of, a lifetime out of a negotiation, but is it sustainable? I mean, is the other side going to be around to pay you? Are you pushing the result to a point where it's not ultimately in your client's long-term interest because the other side, declares bankruptcy and you've lost your supplier and they don't pay the judgment? I mean, thinking that way, thinking beyond the actual, immediacy of the deal to how does this affect the relationship longer term and the business objective longer term, I think is important. So I know those are the big ones that come to mind. But yeah, really an interesting course. I liked it a lot more than I expected to.
Let's turn to the strategic leadership. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite topics to talk to you about and listen to you on. But what about this module really resonated with you at this point in your Oxford career?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of a potpourri. So we had a bunch of different, subjects that were run by different faculty as part of this strategic leader. A couple of them really struck me. One was around the concept of the power of doubt for leaders, which was led by Professor Michael Smets, who's taught us a number of things throughout the course. And, his premise is for leaders, especially senior leaders, some level of professional doubt is important. It's beneficial. It's critical to being good at leading an organization. And so he has kind of created, it's business school. So we have a 4x4 matrix. Everything in business school reduces down to a 4x4 matrix in some way or another. He is this matrix that sort of breaks down on one axis is how much anxiety or confidence you have in a decision, right? And then that maybe be the y-axis. And then the x-axis is how much knowledge you have, how much do you know, how much do you not know about the issue that you're making the decision on. And so he talks a little bit about each quadrant. So, if you've got low knowledge, there's just a lot of unknowns, a lot of unknown facts on the subject you're deciding on. High anxiety, you're also really worried about the consequences of this decision. The most important thing for a leader is to be, to have honest humility and a lot of curiosity. And so the key, if you're in that section, is continuous learning to collect more information, to maybe be cautious about your decision making, maybe incremental in your decision making to avoid making a big mistake. If you move over, I was in the bottom half of our 4-quadrant. We should have a PowerPoint because it's business school. I feel like I'm at a disadvantage here. But if you move over to a quadrant where the knowledge is higher, but the anxiety is still high, so you think you know the answer, but you're still like, this is like I'm not sure. That's when like peer mentoring and benchmarking is important. So as a leader, you can validate through, a fellow CEO or a fellow managing partner. Like, here's what I'm seeing. Am I missing anything here? Feel like this is the right decision, but I have this, anxiety. Anyway, then if you move up to the top half of the quadrant, if you have low knowledge, and low anxiety, so this is like the worst case scenario, right? For a leader, this is like somebody who is confident that they know what the right answer is and that they don't know anything actually about the facts underlying their decision. That quadrant is a risk management quadrant. So that's where, as like a leader, to protect against really bad decisions coming out of that quadrant, you build controls and procedures in place to make sure someone else is checking, because you as a leader are pretty vulnerable to making a bad decision. And then the last piece is just that high knowledge and low anxiety, fearlessness, right? So you know this topic, you know the subject, you're confident in your decision. That's where I think that the theory is the most important piece, is to have a devil's advocate, someone who can challenge your assumptions and make sure you are making a good decision. So I thought it was all really interesting. I mean, I think the biggest insight to me is just I tend to think, we probably all tend to think of leaders as, hyper confident, and that doubt doesn't tend to go alongside effective leadership. And Professor Smetz's view is that it's not only necessary, it's good, and you need to think about it in different ways, how doubt comes into your decision making, and correct for the risk and correct for the potential errors, and build in protections to make sure you're not falling into traps that will lead to bad decision making. I thought it was fascinating. It was a really interesting way to think about leadership.
David, you had a really interesting note, I thought, that I 100% agree with, which is the role of listening in Speak Up.
Yeah, I thought this is the other piece that I really like. So this was a professor, Megan Reitz, has done a bunch of research on this. And I thought it was really interesting from, as like a compliance lawyers that you and I are, right, that we all talk about Speak Up culture, and we all talk about, all our clients are very, our compliance teams and our clients are very interested and invest a lot of energy in promoting a Speak Up culture, right? They want employees to raise their hands and call the hotline, and that's critical. And I think everybody agrees. I think correctly agrees that that's really important. The thing that's missing, I think, from a lot of those programs is focusing on the listening side, right? I think there's an expectation that if you create these structures and you tell employees, we really want you to speak up, that they're going to speak up. And the facts are they don't. There are dynamics in organizations that really make that difficult. A lot has to do with power, right? That the Professor Reitz's research shows that, all the senior executives in companies think that, they're in a Speak Up culture and they feel very comfortable speaking up, and they assume that all their employees feel comfortable speaking up. But when you talk to the junior people, they're like, I'm not speaking up. There's no way I would do that. I don't want to, I don't want to disrupt the organization. I don't want to, disrupt my team. So, being aware of that dynamic, I think, is really important. And I think our clients need to focus more attention on the leadership and training them on how to listen better, how to convey, in tangible ways to the organization that they're serious, and that if people do speak up, that they're going to be listening up. I think I'm just trying to. I took a note on the concept. It's called advantage blindness, is what Megan refers to it as, which is leaders, because of their position and the fact that people listen to them when they speak up, they just assume that sort of permeates through the organization, and the research suggests it does not. So I thought that was particularly interesting. And something to focus on, particularly for compliance people, is on, how do you create that environment? How do you make sure people really are listening, conveying to the constituencies in the organization that they really are listening, that they're heard, that there's a point to speaking up, right? The other thing beyond the power dynamic is just, the idea that, well, nobody's going to do anything about what I say anyway, so why bother, right? Like, even if I am in a position of power, if I feel like it's futile, I'm not gonna bother, creating an issue by speaking up. So I thought there's some really interesting research. There's some lessons there for law firms, but also for our clients about, how can you do this better and create, I think, what is an undeniably positive thing where everybody in the organization is taking some ownership, feeling responsibility, and asking questions, raising issues, raising concerns.
David, it strikes me that insight really is incredibly valuable for the compliance professional, to train middle managers who are often the front line of a speak up culture in terms of employees walking in an office and saying, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something." And that with that, really that insight, maybe we could move listening up to at least as high as the technical skills you have to be a middle manager as well.
Yep, I agree. I agree. And I would recommend Megan's book Megan Reitz, and I think that her co-author's John Higgins, and it's called Speak Up. And it's a pretty short book, easy read that has some really good insights into the research on this, and also some tips for how to do this stuff better.
David, one of the things I'm not sure we specifically touched on, but my sense is that the Oxford experience is looking at things either in a very different way or very different things than we typically look at as lawyers. So I was wondering if I could use that as a long-winded way to add leading into what about some government and ethics topics, insights, or other?
Yeah. So this was, and I think we did a whole episode on the first governance and ethics module with Professor Alan Morrison, which was really great. I loved it. It was right in my wheelhouse. So he had kind of a reprise where he came in for a day and talked about. This kind of gets to our next episode, Tom, about sort of wrapping it up and what comes next. But he spoke to us about, okay, you've now completed this, pretty substantial commitment that has taken up a huge part of your life for 2 years. What do the philosophers say about that? And what, how should you think about that hole that is going to be left by the EMBA program being complete? And it was like it's a classically Oxford, I don't think you'd get this at Wharton or Sloan School, a day-long lecture about the existentialists and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and the philosophy of sort of how when you sort of stop doing something, you have these holes in your life, right? And that your whole existence is to find projects that fill these holes, and that's kind of the meaning of life. At least that's how I understand it. I haven't done any of the source reading of Sartre. I relied on Alan for that, but it was really interesting. It was a really great, way to start thinking about, okay, how does this, what am I doing with this? Right. I've just invested 2 years. I now have something, something that comes out of that. What do I do with it? How does that affect my life? How do I move forward? What holes are now left to fill, and how am I going to project myself into those holes to continue to find meaning? So it was sort of a classic Oxford experience.
I'd like to ask you to take us a little bit deeper into the end of course ceremony. You've talked about some of the ceremonial aspects of your experience. I have to believe this was the ultimate, but I'll leave that to you to tell us about it.
Yeah, it was really neat. So we had actually we started the day. It was the last day. We started the day with a series of Oxford Union style debates, where our class sort of divided up into groups, and we had 4 or 5 topics, and assigned a topic, assigned a side, and we had to prepare to do debate Oxford Union style. And that was really fun. It was a lot of sort of business oriented topics, but it was neat to see my classmates in that role and making really pretty compelling arguments, which was fun. And then we had our end of course ceremony. It was in the Sheldonian Theater in Oxford, which is sort of it's like the centerpiece for ceremony, I would say. At Oxford, all the graduations are there, all the big, sort of the big events are there, and it was actually cool. So the dean gave some remarks, and he talked about how that sort of resonated with me. He talked about how this was, I think, Christopher Wren's first building that he designed.
Wow.
And he talked about, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it's a beautiful setting. But he talked about how architecture was sort of a second career for Christopher Wren. I think he was a professor at Oxford. I can't remember what. I think like history or something totally unrelated to architecture. And later in life, sort of pursued this different project of architecture. And ultimately, obviously, became one of maybe the greatest English architect in history. And that sort of like landed with me as sort of a later in life, going to business school guy, as sort of an inspiration to see someone like that, make a pivot and make tremendous contributions to the world in something maybe slightly different than where he started. So it was really great. We had a reception then at the Divinity School, which is stunning and spectacular. A good chunk of my family was there, all but my youngest daughter, who had just started college, but everybody else was there, and a lot of my classmates had their families. So it was a great opportunity to see people together with their families, meet their parents, meet their spouses, and their kids, and it was great. It was great.
David, we're near the end of this episode, but I would be completely remiss if I didn't ask about the single unique experience every Oxford student has, which is rowing.
Yeah.
Tell us about your final row.
It was a good one. It was weird to be the last one because it's now become kind of a regular cadence for me. It was really nice, and I really appreciated it. I don't know how much. I think we got better over the 2 years, maybe not that much better. We had an incident in year one where we got the boat stuck in a tree that was overhanging part of the river. That didn't happen, and we managed to get the boat up and down the river fairly well. But yeah, I've talked about this before, Tom. It's one of my very favorite things about the experience, and it's beautiful. It's classic Oxford. It's a great way to connect with your classmates in a little bit different way, outside the classroom, out in the fresh air, working together on something that isn't that easy. And it was great. I'm gonna miss it. I don't know. Like I feel like I don't know. Like I'm not good enough at this to actually like take it up as a hobby, but I'm definitely gonna miss the opportunity to row every 6 weeks. Now that I don't have class in Oxford anymore.
Well, David, we are at the end of our time, so I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be with you.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of A Yank at Oxford. I hope you will join us in our next episode, which will be our final episode, where David Simon takes a look forward at what he learned from his Oxford experience and how he hopes to use it in the practice of law or other business going forward. I know you'll enjoy the next and final episode of this great exploration of David Simon's journey to get an executive MBA at Oxford in the podcast A Yank at Oxford, which is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.